And okay, the webcast is underway. Okay, I want to welcome everybody, and this is a conversation about the use of storytelling for therapeutic uses of storytelling. And this field has many, many names, or there are many aspects of this field. Storytelling and healing, therapeutic uses of storytelling, healing uses of storytelling, storytelling and healing, narrative therapy, narrative medicine. I'm sure I've left a few out. And some of these approaches stress telling stories to the client or the patient. Some of them stress the client or the patient telling stories. So we are gathered to hear experiences of people in this field or these many fields regarding what they're doing. If they, as I say, if their work involves helping the patient tell the story or the patient listen to the story, if they're working with true personal experience stories, or if they're working with fantasy stories, we're going to hear. So shall I just quickly introduce the people who are here? Yes, and then each person can say what they're doing. Susan Perrow is with us from Australia at about 3 o'clock in the morning in Australia. Thank you very much, Susan Perrow.
It's a privilege. Thank you very much for inviting me.
And Susan's going to be with us in Chennai next month at the Chennai Storytelling Festival. If I just can say a few words, and I'll probably get this wrong, Susan works especially with creating stories that relate to challenging situations that a client might have. And she uses metaphors to create a fantasy story that relates to the experience of a client, and then I guess you tell the story to the client or discuss it with the client. Anyway, you can correct me in a few moments. Then Sayantani Dasgupta is a professor, a doctor and a professor at Columbia University, working especially with a method of training doctors and other medical caregivers to listen to patients telling the story of their illnesses. Lavanya is a storyteller, story worker here in Chennai who's told stories at the Cancer Institute and different places. Susan, Laura Hopegill, professor at and poet in Asheville, North Carolina, leading a master's degree writing program. Lonnie Peterson, one of the leaders of the Healing Story Alliance, which is a community of people who are involved in this field. And there's a website, there's a listserv, and I personally want to thank Lonnie and the Healing Story Alliance for guiding me in my research and learning about this whole field. And Asha Sampath, another one of our storytellers in Chennai, who also tells stories in various situations, including hospitals and so forth. So who wants to correct me first in my introductions? Or somebody say a few words about, okay, I'm going to say something provocative. I believe storytelling therapy should take its place alongside dance therapy, music therapy, art therapy, and I'm frustrated that storytelling therapy is not really known yet. So I'm wondering if all these different approaches together could be considered under the umbrella of storytelling therapy, and I'm wondering if we can get storytelling therapy on the map. So does anyone have any responses to that? Do you think this is a foolish project that I'm suggesting, or please someone give me a response?
I'll say I don't think it's foolish at all. I think that it's something that is hidden in plain sight. So many people are hungry for this that they haven't even, but they haven't recognized a means of making it happen. everyone that I've spoken to about narrative medicine seems to say, I already know about this, I already do this, I already want this. And I ask them how, and it's already happening, but we haven't had a codified, systematic approach to it.
So do we need a codified approach to it?
Well, I believe that the Columbia program has created a way of integrating storytelling into medical training.
I mean, I can speak to the Columbia program if it, would be appropriate and of interest.
Please do.
So again, I'll present my own take on it. My colleagues at Columbia may or may not agree. But I have been at the program since in 2001. Rita Sharon, who's my colleague, who is a physician and English PhD, a literary scholar, she pulled together an interdisciplinary group of not just English professors, but philosophers, film professors, people like me who came from a kind of social justice, public health background. I'm a pediatrician by training and have a public health background. And we came together and we began first just simply teaching medical students and residents. And our notion was that there had to be a better way to teach what was hitherto called kind of doctor-patient communication or bedside manner. There had to be a more rigorous and theoretically sound way to teach this. Because in the same way that we would never graduate somebody from medical school who didn't know their basic anatomy or physiology or pharmacology, or nursing school or therapy school or what have you, similarly, we all kind of shared the viewpoint that we should be, loath to graduate anyone from any clinical school who didn't know how to interact with, meaning elicit, interpret, and act upon patient stories. And that this was just as important and rigorous a skill set. And we knew that we weren't saying something new. We knew that we were kind of going back to an old practice. But we wanted to go back to that practice in a interdisciplinary, rigorous, theoretically sound way. About 4 or 5 years ago, we started a master's program in which not only clinicians in training can get a master's degree, but also others, memoirists, documentarians, people interested in embodied stories, healthcare-related stories for a variety of reasons. And I think that the one thing that we have realized is that while we may have a particular perspective, a particular methodology, we are also a part of a greater family of educators involved in health and humanities throughout the US, UK, Canada, and now increasingly, as we see on this phone call, throughout the world. And I think the benefit of these sorts of recognizing these sorts of alliances is actually our heterogeneity. So while some of us may be approaching it as how do you train clinicians to listen in a rigorous, codified, theoretically sound way, others of us may be using storytelling on the ground, on the floor, in the clinic, in therapeutic ways. And I think that the kind of artificial separations that have kept these conversations, in their own corners, are slowly kind of starting to crumble. And I think phone calls like this are a sign of that, that separation slowly getting erased. I can speak a bit more about my own work in memoir. I can speak a bit more later about the sorts of theoreticians like Arthur Frank who rely a lot on storytelling to talk about illness memoir. But perhaps for now I'll just simply leave it at that and allow everyone else to introduce themselves. But I mean, essentially, in a nutshell, what we do in the narrative medicine program is seek to honor, seek to re-recognize the central role of story in the healthcare endeavor. But in doing so, seek to put that sort of storied knowledge on an equal footing with a scientific knowledge. And maybe I'll kind of leave it at that.
Yes, and actually I think it might be a good idea if, when people are not talking, to mute their mic, because there is a little bit of sound coming through. I think near the top of the screen on the left, one can mute one's mic. So am I correct in thinking that the program in narrative medicine stresses the healthcare professional listening and encouraging the patient to construct or to express the story of the patient's illness, and so if this would be the case, you're not training you're not training your students to be storytellers, and also do you try to keep things to autobiographical stories, or do you also encourage patients to go into fantasy?
Well, it's interesting because, in fact, my answer to your question on one level might be yes. We're training people to listen to stories, but in that process, it's very interesting. I think the way you teach people to listen to stories is you also teach them to tell their own stories and have a firm sense of the professional and personal cadre of stories that they carry around with them that then impact their ability to interact with the stories of others. And so, in fact, we do have our students write their own stories. I also have my students go out and do oral histories. And increasingly, we look to other methodologies, but I would say that the primary methodology that particularly my English colleagues use is we go to written text. And those texts may be autobiography, but they also go very deeply into fiction, poetry, any other sorts of narratives that give us insight into how stories work, how protagonists work, how conflict works, how metaphor works in telling tales of the body. And so really we do not just, we not only draw from interdisciplinary spaces. So I will, in the course of one 14-section semester class, draw from oral history, trauma studies, cultural studies, certainly narrative studies, disability studies I tend to draw from deeply, but we'll also draw from various genres, so fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and the like.
Mm-hmm. Somebody else, will you tell us about how your work your approach is similar or different?
I'd love to speak from a slightly different perspective. As Eric introduced me, he didn't mention that my background is as a psychologist, so I want to just clarify that of the context that I'm speaking from, but also as a member of the Healing Story Alliance, which is an attempt to integrate the multiple modalities that Eric began by introducing. So it's an acknowledgement that people use story in healing contexts, but are coming from a multiple number of disciplines and towards
Lonnie, please excuse me for interrupting. Would you tilt your camera a little bit so we can see you a little bit more? Because yes, thank you so much. Yes.
Yeah, good.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So just to acknowledge even how you introduced, Eric, that it's called many different things, but in fact they are different things. I think narrative medicine is very different from narrative therapy. People who are using story to work with individuals are not necessarily have a professional background in either medicine or psychology, but certainly are doing healing work. Even the people who are represented here on your call who are medical doctors, mental health practitioners, poets, public health representatives. It's a very rich and diverse group. We're all using story, and it's hard, I think, the common umbrella is story, but I think we have to be very sensitive and acknowledge both what we're trying to accomplish and what our background is in that as we represent ourselves to our various clients or patients that we're working with. So it's very complicated, and as you try to talk about codifying it, I think that it's such a rich and complex umbrella. I don't know if we're serving the task or actually minimizing it by trying to put us under too much of one category. I think there's a lot of richness to learn from each other, and in the work that I'm doing, I think I span many of the disciplines you're talking about, depending on the client I'm with. I have a private practice in psychology where I use narrative therapy. I'm also doing work in prisons where I'm both telling story, where I talk about being a healing teller to a wounded listener, At times, I'm also a healing listener to a wounded teller, and that at any time I'm aware of what I'm trying to accomplish, whether I am speaking or listening in that relationship. So I am excited and respect what you're trying to do. I also just want to acknowledge the complexity and how each of us need to be clear in what we're trying to accomplish in any moment that we're bringing story into a relationship, and what our background and skills are in that that we're bringing to the work.
Well, just like there are many different types of drama therapy, there are many different approaches within art therapy. Naturally, there'll be many different approaches regarding using storytelling. I don't even know if we should use storytelling therapy as a blanket term, but I'm actually interested. What is referred to by the term narrative therapy? I know this is a field that's especially developed in Australia.
Yes.
Could someone tell us what is narrative therapy?
I know that there's a representative from Australia, and I don't know if she wants to speak to it. Anne, is that right?
Susan Perro.
Well,
are you familiar with it, Susan?
Yes, I can't really speak for narrative therapy. I work in a completely different way with storytelling. I write stories for particular situations, particular behaviors, particular traumas. I'm working all over the world with people in the Philippines at the moment, in the evacuation centers. I've worked with Japanese publishers with stories for the tsunami family who survived. I've worked with just very simple behaviors with children, but particularly writing stories to match and hopefully transform, even help a little bit with challenging behaviors and situations. So I'm not a narrative therapist, so I'm afraid I'm not someone who can speak to that.
That's okay. Now, when you compose a story, do you then tell it to the person who's experiencing the challenging behavior?
Every context is different. Sometimes I work with the parents, and then if it's a story for children, they might read the story to children at bedtime, or might tell it to them over the dinner table. I might work with teachers, and the teachers might share the story with the whole class. Might work with teenagers, and the teenagers might also help write part of the story. I might set something up and they might finish it. Every context is very different. But I would just like to say, to answer your first question, Eric, no, it is not a stupid idea that you have. It's so deep in our humanity, and I'm lucky that I have worked many years in Africa, and I have been very enriched by the storytelling culture that lives so strongly just in the metaphors, in how people speak to each other. It is so much stronger in some cultures than others. And also I would love to acknowledge, while I've got the microphone at the moment, how much America and Canada are leading in this field, and how much I have eaten from your work. The Healing Story Alliance, the center in Iowa. I was in Iowa in April last year, and they run an amazing conference once a year called This Examined Life, where they try to bring story and poetry into the medical field. And also in Canada, in Simon Fraser University, they are trying to bring story into the very core of education so that it sits at the heart of teaching. So there is very big things happening in your North American continent, and I'm very grateful that I can feed from that. So I just wanted to use this chance to say that from the other side of the world.
Susan, I know your method works a lot with metaphor. And
yes.
When I mention metaphor to people in my workshops, the question often comes up, why? Why should we create metaphors? Why not just stick with more realistic, down-to-earth representations of happenings? And I would put this out to everyone. You know, what are some possible values of spinning fantasy, of creating metaphors for experience?
Well, I will give a very quick answer. Sorry, just a very quick answer because you mentioned my name. Metaphor speaks to the heart and not to the intellect. And I think this is where it's such a strong source of healing when we can reach people's hearts. It's quite simplistic, but I'll now hand it over to someone else.
I mean, certainly Susan Sontag in, Illness as Metaphor, her kind of classic text, warns us against the dangers of metaphor. And I think that, although clearly, she's been, her work has been discussed. In fact, her work deeply uses metaphor to debunk metaphor. But I think the one important thing, even in that kind of historical text, that she reminds us of is not to be too precious about story, is the fact that, in fact, stories aren't always used for just or good ends, and to examine things like power in stories, like who is telling the story and who is being told about, and whose voice is being heard and whose voice is being silenced. And I certainly think that while metaphors can be used for wonderful, just, positive, healing ways, they can just as equally and do just as equally get used for unjust ends. For instance, one aspect of storytelling that seems to happen over and over again in contexts of genocide is that one's neighbors suddenly get narrated differently. Suddenly we begin telling these stories about our neighbors not as fellow human beings, but either reducing them to animals or to threats or, to vermin, these sorts of metaphors. We, see it in, it happened in Rwanda, it happened certainly in Europe during the Holocaust. And so I think that what interests me a lot about metaphor and story is the notion that it's really important, who's creating the metaphor, for what ends, and where the power lies, who's talking and who's getting talked about. And so I wouldn't blanket say that metaphor is necessarily always just or healing, but I think it's incredibly powerful in either direction, and it behooves us to pay attention to the kind of directions of power, like who's talking and who's getting talked about.
Mm-hmm. Sayantani actually gave me a nice leeway to talk about narrative therapy, because that's essentially what it's about, that all story is construct. And the premise of narrative therapy is that some of our stories are actually positive and empower us, and some of our stories are highly destructive to us, keep us paralyzed or moving in directions that are unhealthy for us. So to examine how our stories that we have constructed in creating meaning in our lives, how they're working for us, and those that aren't positive or helpful or healing, how to actually shift those stories so that they can move us forward in a very different kind of way. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not only metaphor, but it's story in general that are powerful and can be used for positive or for negative, and that's what the examination is all about.
Mm-hmm. I came to narrative medicine in part because of a diagnosis. I was diagnosed with degenerative hearing loss in my late 20s, and I was devastated. The metaphors I had received for deafness were abysmal. I had received Beethoven, grumpy and carved in marble on top of the piano, images of Helen Keller in the Melissa Gilbert film, soaked in mud, and a feeling of a complete lack of definition. And when diagnosis comes into our lives, we have to fill it somehow. And the first step for me was breaking through the metaphors I had inherited for deafness and to reopen them all. And I did that by writing and by talking eventually about my hearing loss, which I didn't do at all at the beginning. But it was through writing and finding new metaphors for hearing loss, drawing on everything from the Whispering Gallery at the top of St. Paul's to metaphors for silence in Buddhist writings, and then looking at the New Testament and Old Testament for references to ears. And that allowed me to actually move through my diagnosis into actually considering myself a perfectly hearing person, even working with 40–50% of my hearing ability. So metaphors did heal. Even if they didn't change the deafness clinically, they transformed it spiritually for me.
So using metaphors and shaping a story really is a way of taking control over one's life.
It
As
was.
they say,
It was a
you
long
can't-
journey.
You can't change the facts of your situation, but you can change your relationship to those facts, and that's what story is the meaning you make of the facts that happen and how that meaning shapes, holds you, and carries you forward.
Wonderful.
Yes.
I want to introduce Linda Whiteside, is it?
Yes.
Joining us from California. Linda teaches at University of California at San Diego, and also is part of a healing arts program at Rady Children's Hospital. Could you tell us maybe a little bit about the healing arts program at Rady Children's Hospital?
Sure. Children's Hospital here in San Diego is the largest children's hospital in Southern California, so people come from all over to our hospital. And we have a healing arts department that includes 2 harpists, a guitar player, a visual artist, and 3 storytellers, and a drummer. And I'm one of the storytellers. I tell stories in Spanish. We have a large Spanish-speaking population here in San Diego since we're so close to the border with Mexico. And I go around to the emergency room and to the hematology oncology and med-surg and pre-op and post-op and the Ronald McDonald House where the families stay. They have to have a long period of time in the hospital. And I tell folk tales and legends, and I use my drum and puppets to entertain the kids and give the parents a break. And sometimes when I come into the room and tell the parents that I'm happy to stay for a half an hour and tell stories, and so the parents can have a break from being in the room constantly, and they can go get something to eat in the cafeteria, and they know that their child won't be alone. And we have just a wonderful department. As far as we know, we're the only professional healing arts department in the country, so we're really happy about it and proud about it. We're all funded by donations. We have women and men who raise money for us every 3 years locally, and they keep us in business. Usually there's just one artist in the hospital each day. So we, for instance, in my case, I only work 6 to 8 hours a week because I have another job. So that's what I do.
So do you coach your patients in telling stories at all?
Absolutely. I carry a drum around me, a drum with me that makes an ocean sound, and that's kind of how I introduce myself to a new patient. It's nonverbal, and it's very soothing, the sound, and it's very non-threatening. And then I have to kind of intuitively read the situation, whether or not the child is well enough to hear a story and pay attention, how long they can pay attention, what age is appropriate, what kind of mood or tone. There's also other factors involved in a hospital setting, and that's that sometimes the kids can't eat if they're pre-surgery, so you don't want to tell any stories about food, and there's a lot of folk tales with food in them. Sometimes the kids need to be eating because they're receiving chemotherapy and their appetite is down, so you want to tell a lot of stories about food to get them excited about eating. So there's a lot of intuitive judgment made that has to be done very quickly. And then when I start to tell a story, a lot of times I'll just say, well, I have 500 stories in my head. Tell me a little bit about yourself, and I'll pick one that's good for you. And that's usually how I get into the story, and I choose a story that way. Sometimes I'll just say, would you like to play my drum? And the patient will play the drum, and then I'll say, you know, we can tell a story together if you want. I can start with the first line, or you can start with the first line. And so co-constructing stories is super fun because you never know what's going to happen, and it's always healing for the patient to speak through another voice, either a dragon's voice or a puppet's voice, or they make up a completely new character.
Wonderful.
Eric.
Yes.
Can I share a few things with you all?
Go ahead.
Eric?
Go ahead.
Yeah. I have worked in a similar context with the children who are affected by cancer in the pediatric ward of the cancer hospital at Adyar. I have also worked with adults who have suffered from cancer, and this reminds me especially of the pediatric ward storytelling. There, the situation was slightly different in the sense it was a group of several children of different languages and different states coming in. It is more of a floating population as they were all undergoing treatment, chemo for their cancer problem. So the children would sometimes, go for a chemo and then join halfway through. And there would be some children who have just had a chemo, and what I was trying with them was a totally just an enjoyable, joyous story where children just forget about the pain and the reality, the present moment where they go through a very painful exercise. So just the sheer joy of a very happy story, or maybe, a very colorful, some kind of celebration, some kind of joyous situation helped them a lot. I didn't even have to do anything extra to try to make it a healing experience for them. Just the sheer joy of listening to the story. I did try to, sort of encourage them to share the stories, but it was interesting that most of them preferred to be just passive, in the sense, listen, but not, tell stories or share stories. And another very touching or even interesting note was that a couple of children just did not want to even listen to the story. It was a first experience for me with the children, and I just did not want to go too deep into the reasons for it, but slowly the power of storytelling brought them into the group, and they started enjoying the stories, which I also tried with a small activity. The children who were not very keen on listening to the story, I handed a couple of papers and colors to the kids, and as they were drawing, slowly they just came and sat with us, and they started listening to the stories. And I'm sure I was, it was so obvious, I could notice that they had forgotten about the chemo and the pain that went along with it, and they enjoyed, they were laughing, and in between we had a bit of a small dance and song sequence. So they joined us with pleasure, and that was a very, very satisfying experience for me.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Is somebody raising their hand?
Yes, that is me.
Go ahead.
Yes. Well, now that we're going into some real practical situation stories, I would like to come back to one particular way to work with metaphor with young people is to, and this is something I have done. I've worked in Nairobi with Medicine Sans Frontier, and young people dying of AIDS, I have encouraged them to write their life story, but to choose a totem or a metaphor for them as the central character in this story. And the feedback has been that this has really freed them. It has freed them from cultural taboos. One particular young man was able to write the life story of a little rabbit. And in this, he was able to truly say how the terrible things the father had done to the mother, and then how he ended up out in the fields, lost, and then how he was taken in by a new rabbit family, which was actually Medicine Sans Frontier. But the main reason why I'm sharing this was that through this very positive use of metaphor, it was able to free people from cultural and not just cultural, but personal hang-ups, inhibitions, and so on. And one other very quick example, a little 8-year-old girl wrote the story. She was being bullied at school, and she wrote the story about a little red truck. And she talked about how the truck was painted a different color. I won't go into the whole story, but it helped her find her own way through this victim of bullying. Yes, thank you.
I would like to ask something.
Go ahead, Asha.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Hi, first of all, very nice to meet all of you. I've been reading about you from the links that Eric sent us. Very interesting, and I'm happy that I'm talking to experts here. My question is, what I've heard so far is about people who have been in pain, and you tell them stories so they are healed. My question is, how about telling stories to people uh, who um, who can be prevented from doing wrongful deeds? Because the kind of society that we live in today and the kind of stories we read in papers and hear over the news channels about abuse and rape and murder and killings and whatnot, um, is there a way that people can heal or get rid of these thoughts in their mind before the act is committed? Would stories be helpful in that way? Would they be called as healing stories at that point too?
Go ahead.
Can I respond? So in the same way, it was Lonnie, who was speaking about issues of power in the dyadic, in like the one-on-one narrative therapy relationship. I think, something I've been trying to think about is, the broader, so as you're speaking of, Asha, the broader kind of public health, social, and political implications of, social stories. So I think that we can talk about, individual, relational stories in the one-on-one relationship, and we can talk about relational stories in the broader, social relationships that we have. And I think that, so for me, it's been very useful. I teach a seminar called Narrative Health and Social Justice, and I also run a faculty-level think tank of that same name. And so I think about these sorts of issues that you're asking about, Asha. I'm not sure that there's a simple answer, but I certainly look to movements like, the feminist movement in the U.S. and around the world, the civil rights movements in the U.S. and around the world, who came to the conclusion that personal stories were ultimately political stories, and that the way we narrate female passivity or female worth has a huge impact on not just individual health, but broader issues of justice and health. For instance, violence against women. And so I do think that, so sometimes in my classes I have my students look at things like reporting around issues of, for instance, the sorts of reporting that was going on in the international community around the various kind of rape stories in India. And I was really interested in having my students think about, well, who is telling these stories and for what purpose? And are some of these stories that are coming out of, let's say, the UK or the US only reinforcing certain stereotypes about South Asian women or about women in the global South, and kind of telling sorts of rescue narratives? And what was the purpose of those sorts of stories? And were they just or unjust? And so I think that we can have these sorts of conversations about narrative, health, and bodies at individual and at social levels. And to me, that's a very interesting pairing. But again, with the caveat, again, as Lonnie says, that these are, somewhat different conversations also.
Mm-hmm. That is true.
Yeah,
I'd love to add on to that.
Oh, go ahead, Lonnie. Did you want to add to that?
I would love to add on to that. And every time we tell a story, whether it's a moral, a fable, or a personal story, what we're doing is actually touching the listener's personal story and their construct and impacting it in a way that shifts their perspective of meaning and how it's held. So every story they hear then becomes part of their repertoire of stories that they fit in, and through that decide what is meaningful to me, what do I choose to hold on to, what do I choose to let go of. We have both our individual repertoire of stories, we have our cultural repertoire of stories. So we're talking about multiple levels that are happening whenever we hear a story that comes to us. But to take what Santani said, as well as Asha's question, to shift someone's behavior, whether we're leading with a fictional tale or a personal story, we have to also think of the context that they're listening from and how to help them integrate this new information in such a way that they can then integrate it into their meaning system and ultimately their behavior system that allows change to occur. So it's we're understanding so much more now about the brain and how it works and how information is held, how behavior is solidified, and how it can shift and change. And story is at the heart of it. I do a lot of work in hospitals, but also in prisons, working with groups of prisoners, both in telling story, but eliciting their response to the stories told or their stories that evolve out of that. And the shift in perspective is very powerful and moving and exciting. And I've seen huge change through story when it is fit to the context and the need.
Thank you.
This seems to lean back to what Linda was saying about co-creation of stories that as she's creating with children. But the physician or the caregiver in any capacity is the co-creator of a story with the patient. And I find this aspect of narrative medicine very appealing. It also helps break down our epidemic of objectification that we see, non-listening in the busy world in which we live, and particularly placing it in the examining room, where one person is essentially listening to another person's story, and it transforms the relationship between patient and physician to one of storyteller and listener, and everyone who's told a story and has listened to a story knows that that telling changes both people. My father was a physician, and he never spoke the story side of his clinical experiences. And I think I watched it wear on him, that he carried so much, that the caregiver, the teacher, whatever capacity a professional is behaving in, is transformed as well. And that part fascinates me.
And I would suggest that we are co-creating every moment we're in any interaction.
Yes,
and what
yes.
Eric is suggesting we do is bring that to a conscious, thoughtful level so that we are moving the co-creation in the direction that both parties are amenable towards.
Yeah.
But also, I just want to add to that and say that, but that understanding of stories is not present in many disciplines in a professional way. So in medicine, in law, we tend to think, and I'm sure in many other professions, in the social sciences, we tend to think of stories sometimes as fixed, immutable objects. So I will tell my medical student or intern, right? I mean, I won't necessarily, but one might tell one's medical student, go get the story, right? As if they're Indiana Jones, they're going to go dig me up a statue and hand it to me. And if I have that understanding of stories as fixed, immutable objects, not as co-created relationships that exist uniquely in time and space, right? Which is what I'm trying to get my students to understand related stories as. But if my students continue as their professional culture dictates, Lonnie was talking about, cultural systems, and one of the cultural stories that medical students are told are this way to understand patient stories as fixed objects. If my students continue on that path of thinking of stories in this way, then they have no choice but to deem certain patients bad storytellers when the story that they tell, one day differs from the story that they told the last, or the story that they tell may be slightly different than the story that the lab results are telling. And so because we don't have room in our professional culture to think about the import of the listener to the story told, to think about the way that stories change day to day, to think about the way that we tell one aspect of a story to one person who reminds us of our beloved aunt, and we tell another aspect of our story to another person who frightens us, right? Because we don't have that language in our professional culture, then we say, that guy's story's inconsistent. He's a bad storyteller. Let's not listen to him anymore. Let's just rely on, the sodium and the potassium and the MRI and the CAT scan and what have you. But by changing the nature of the way that my students understand what a story is, then they make room to not just listen better, but get better information, do their jobs better, have increased professional satisfaction, hopefully, heal people better, have better healthcare results as a result of that. And I think that to tell people, yeah, just the way you understand what a story is may result in an entirely different health outcome. That seems like an outlandish claim to make, and yet we can see how, what the relationship is there. That it's really important for students to understand that stories are co-created relationships in fields like medicine and in fields like law, because it does change the way we do our work.
I just want to add that the civil rights movement in the USA, and then the feminist movement and the gay rights movement, all of those have involved people sitting around and talking about their personal experiences, and often realizing that their personal experiences were not just personal, but were the social issues and social problems. So this is one way that storytelling has lent itself to social reform, improvement of society, through whether you call them rap sessions or consciousness-raising sessions. This is part of the history of the storytelling revival, which I think is it's a wonderful thing, and I'm sure it's continuing now through patients talking about their conditions. And I know that people with certain conditions come to be not proud of their condition to some extent, but sometimes they see advantages to their condition. And I know that when people in a community that have the same condition, they sometimes develop folklore about it and stories about it, which give them strength. All right, now we just have about 10 minutes left, or 10 or 15 minutes left.
Eric, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
Yes, I have a small doubt. Where exactly do we position the stories told to children? Because mostly parents tell stories to children while they're either crying or to make them sleep, when they're uncomfortable or with some discomfort, or they are weeping, or they fight with somebody or with their siblings. So how do you categorize them? Where do you place or position?
We're talking about a very wide range of different ways of using stories and storytelling here.
Yeah.
What you're referring to is a very real, very popular situation, but very different from the issue of having patients construct and share their life stories.
No, but do we position them amongst healing, storytelling and healing? Can we do it? Or
yeah, I think they both involve healing, and one common element in all of it is that stories are models. They're models of the past and models for the future. So when we construct and present models for ourselves and for others, we are, inspiring people to follow that model or avoid that model if it's a cautionary tale. And I think there is something healing in itself about just getting into the imagination, and there is something healing about the storytelling relationship, just being together and telling and listening. So there are common denominators in these different types of storytelling work.
Okay, thank you.
And I think, yes, if I could just add to that, I think every story has the potential to heal. We can't examine a story first and say, will this be a healing story or not? Every different kind of story, whether it's an everyday story, a nature story, a fantasy story, a life story, has healing potential, and no one can categorize it beforehand, because we don't know what the listener is bringing, what the listener is searching for, or can add to it. And if I can just add to Asha's question about the social problems, I think it's a very important task for our common time, that we have to try and meet this with fantasy stories, with narrative therapy, with every kind of storytelling that people have touched on here. And if we had more time, I would love to talk more about social stories. But Asha, I want to email you. I think we all have each other's emails, don't we?
Yes, and you'll be meeting Asha and Lavanya and me in a few weeks.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Then at the conference, we will have a chance to write stories.
Definitely.
Okay. Wonderful.
Linda, it's almost time for closing words. Will you add something? Will you help pull this all together?
Sure. Well, I feel so grateful and thankful that you set this up, Eric. I feel honored to be listening to all of you, and I've enjoyed the questions that you've asked and your responses. I think any story is a story well told, and any story can change someone's life. I agree with many of you who have said that we can't say how the story feels. It has its own power. And I always just say a little prayer inside my heart before I tell a story, that the story feel in its own way, whatever the listener wants to receive it, and I'll offer the story as a gift. So all of your stories have been a gift for me today, and I appreciate you including me in on this call.
Great. I want to say that 15 years ago, when I was a graduate student at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, I had already been working with video conferencing for years. But what I discovered at Penn was that the universities were not just having video conferences, but they were webcasting their video conferences, and that you could see a recording of the webcast afterwards. So I thought this is so fantastic, and I helped professors do it, and I did it. But now, 15 years later, Google is allowing us to do the same thing for free at the moment. So I want to express gratitude to Google for enabling the webcast and that hopefully, if things go well, the recording of this conversation will be on a link on YouTube, which I'll share with all of you. The ability to webcast and have a recording of a video conference is such a powerful tool for communication, for teaching, for marketing. It's really a wonderful, wonderful medium.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this.
Yeah. So, will anyone say some words about the future? You know, with economic difficulties being there around the world, is it really possible that hospitals are going to find budgets for storytelling in the medical context?
I think that the patient demand is really high. I think that everybody wants it. And so if people keep saying what they want, that it will happen.
And I think the case that I will sometimes make is that, in fact, if you, and this is, of course, from my own perspective of if you are training nurses, doctors, therapists, chaplains, social workers to be more effective, efficient, empowered story listeners and story elicitors and co-creators of stories in the healthcare context, then you are actually creating situations where you might save money, where one might, not need the X number of MRIs and CAT scans to chase down the esoteric diagnosis that I think it might be, because, gee, I have been trained to sit down and sit on my hands and not take notes and really listen and engage, and I have actually gotten the clues to the diagnosis. It's returning to this skill set that kind of existed in a so highly technological medicine. And certainly I'm not saying let's go back to those days. MRIs are good things. But it's saying that's a skill set that also needs to be used. And we don't always need to go for the most expensive test. Sometimes simply sitting down and being a really good listener gets you the right diagnosis. And that's kind of what the old greats told us.
It's very difficult to generate statistics to support what you're saying. When you're talking to people to convince them to join a 2-year master's degree, or when you're talking to hospitals, if you do talk to hospitals, aside from Columbia Medical Center, University Medical Center, to persuade them to make this part of their program. And Linda, I'm asking you also, do hospital administrators and do insurance companies really warm up to this?
Mm-hmm. Well, in my experience,
Go ahead.
Here in San Diego, I work also with another hospital, a group of 5 hospitals called Swift Health. And those hospitals hire me to work with their leaders in using storytelling to lead through change, to elicit patient trust, to manage more effectively, to create communication workshops. So they have had me there for 6 years, and they always find the money in the budget. I'm there 4 to 8 times a year to train their emerging leaders, and that all comes from evaluation feedback. So if there's a need for the training from the people who are doing the evaluations, they'll find money for it. So I have a very positive attitude about finding funding. I think it's the trick of finding the key to get the people who will pay for it. So sometimes it's just an issue of finding out who has the money and then telling them a great, short, precise story. And when their hearts are open to it, they will fund it. I always believe there's money for anything you're going to do in storytelling. I've created a life full of storytelling that I've had for 10 years here in Southern California, in and out of the session. It's just an issue of finding who has the money, and there's always money somewhere. You just have to find that person who has it.
Okay, would anyone add anything?
Yes, if I could. I wanted to say that hospitals are very financially based, and that statistic research needs to be done to support it, and that research is happening. I'm actually working with a group at UMass Medical Center that is trying to put the research behind the impact of story on patient response to treatment. And it's very exciting work that they're doing. Also, the research that's being done on the brain and understanding the power of story and plasticity and change is, I think, going to support the money that's being put into this kind of work. It's just beginning. We're just at the forefront of it, and it's very exciting. And I think the more that is known, the more the story is going to be financially supported and brought into all different kinds of mediums. I think we're at the forefront of it. It's an exciting place to be.
Wonderful. Anybody else want to add anything?
Just a big thank you from Down Under.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody, and I guess with that we'll all hang up.
Wonderful. Lovely to meet you all. Just lovely.
Thank you. Lovely to meet all of you.
Again.
Lovely talking to you all, getting to know you all.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Eric.
Good night. Good morning.
Bye.
Good afternoon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.